The story began, as so many life-altering things do, with a phone call at the worst possible time. Amelia Grant had been sitting cross-legged on the worn beige carpet of her small apartment living room, surrounded by half-folded laundry, when the shrill buzz of her phone cut through the quiet hum of the ceiling fan. The display showed her cousin's number, a woman who rarely called and never for anything casual. A prickling unease ran down her spine before she even answered. Her cousin's voice was sharp with urgency, every word clipped as though time itself were a fragile thing they might shatter if they lingered too long. "Amelia, it's your father. He's in the hospital. You need to come home now." For a moment, Amelia forgot to breathe. Her father, her solid, unshakable father, who could lift heavy sacks of grain with one hand, who could fix any engine with a glance, who could still run faster than half the boys in the village, was in the hospital. Words tangled in her throat. She wanted details, wanted the whole story, but the phone connection crackled, making her cousin's voice faint and warped. The message was clear enough. Her father was critically ill. Time was running out. Amelia's first instinct was to throw clothes into a suitcase and book the earliest flight. But her cousin's voice, now laced with something like hesitation, stopped her. "You know how the family is," she said carefully, as though she were trying to place explosives without detonating them. They still remember how you left. They still think you ran away to the city to live some godless life. If you come back now, they'll expect answers. They'll expect proof that you've settled." The word hung in the air like a bad smell. Settled. In her family's dictionary, that meant one thing: marriage. Amelia pressed her hand to her forehead, a sharp ache beginning behind her temples. She knew exactly what her cousin meant. Her family, deeply traditional, almost to the point of stubborn cruelty, believed a woman's life didn't start until she was securely married. To them, her move to the city years ago had been reckless, shameful. Even she'd refused every suitor they tried to line up for her. She'd chosen independence over the stifling safety of tradition. And now, with her father's health in danger, that same independence was about to slam a door in her face. Her cousin's final words before the call ended were simple but devastating. "If you want to see him, Amelia, you need to bring your husband." After the line went dead, Amelia sat frozen on the carpet. The fan still hummed overhead. The laundry still lay half-folded, but the world had shifted in a way she couldn't undo. Husband, she didn't have one. She didn't even have a boyfriend she could convincingly present as such. There was no time for elaborate explanations or arguments with her family. They would see any hesitation as proof she hadn't made a proper life for herself, and they'd bar her from her father's bedside out of pride and spite. The panic came fast, rolling over her in hot waves. She paced the apartment, her mind racing through impossible options. Hiring someone? Too risky. Asking a friend? None she could trust with something this monumental. Lying outright? They would see through it immediately. The only clear fact was that she needed a man, believable, living, breathing man at her side, and she needed him now. It was while she was leaning against the kitchen counter, staring at the peeling paint on the opposite wall, that she thought of him. Daniel Reeves. Apartment for B. She'd seen him often enough in the hallway, tall, with an almost apologetic posture, the kind of man who moved quietly through the world, as if trying not to disturb it. They'd exchanged nods, the occasional polite good morning, but never a full conversation. She knew almost nothing about him beyond the fact that he worked irregular hours, wore plain clothes, and always carried a battered leather satchel. He seemed kind in that distant, careful way some people have, like a lighthouse keeping watch but never calling attention to itself. She almost laughed at the thought. Ask a stranger to pretend to be her husband. It was absurd, dangerous, desperate, and yet the idea rooted itself stubbornly in her mind. Daniel had no ties to her family. No one back home knew him, and something about his quiet, self-contained nature made her think he wouldn't gossip or make things unnecessarily complicated. The next afternoon, she found herself standing outside his door, knuckles hovering inches from the wood. She almost turned away 3 times before finally knocking. The sound echoed down the hallway, followed by a pause long enough for her to reconsider the entire thing. Then the door swung open. Daniel looked at her with mild surprise, one eyebrow lifting as if to ask without words why she was there. Up close, she noticed details she'd missed before, the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his hazel eyes seemed to shift color with the light, the scent of coffee clinging faintly to his shirt. "Hi," she began, her voice catching slightly. "This is going to sound insane, but I need your help. It's urgent." He didn't interrupt, didn't make a joke at her expense. Instead, he stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. The apartment was spare but neat, smelling faintly of books and cedar. She sat on the edge of his couch, clutching her hands together, and told him everything: her father's illness, her family's impossible demands, the cruel condition attached to her visiting. When she finished, there was a long silence. Daniel sat in the armchair opposite her, elbows resting on his knees, his gaze steady but unreadable. She expected him to refuse. She would have refused. in his position, but instead, he leaned back slightly, rubbed his jaw, and said, "So, you need someone to play your husband." "Just for a while." "Yes," she admitted. "Just for a few weeks, just long enough to convince them. Then you can go back to your life and we'll pretend none of this happened." He tilted his head, considering. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," she said, surprising herself with how true it felt. He smiled faintly, a small curve of the lips that was more acknowledgement than amusement. "All right," he said finally, "I'll do it." Amelia blinked. "Just like that. Just like that." He stood, extending his hand. She rose hesitantly, placing her palm in his. His grip was warm, steady, grounding. "Temporary arrangement," he said. "No strings. We'll keep it simple." They shook on it, their clasped hands sealing an agreement that was supposed to be a performance, just lines and gestures, a facade to pacify her family. Neither of them realized that in that moment, with that simple handshake, they were stepping into something neither could fully control. The first days after their handshake agreement were awkward, to put it mildly. Amelia had always thought herself adaptable. She could adjust to new cities, new jobs, new apartments without too much fuss. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the bizarre intimacy of preparing to pretend to be married to a man she barely knew. They started small. That first evening, Daniel came over to her apartment with a notepad and a pen, as if they were about to start a project for work rather than fabricate an entire relationship. He sat across from her at the narrow kitchen table, his expression composed but faintly amused. The notepad lay between them, blank and expectant, while the coffee machine sputtered in the background. "All right," he said, clicking the pen open with an easy motion. "We need a history. Something simple but convincing. Dates, places, a couple of personal stories in case anyone asks." Amelia poured them both coffee, the rich scent filling the small space. She took her seat, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. "Right. So, how long have we been married?" He leaned back slightly, considering. "Too short, and they'll think it's suspicious. Too long, and they'll have more questions. How about 2 years? 2 years sounds reasonable." She nodded, scribbling the number down in the corner of a scrap paper she'd brought out for herself. They went back and forth like that, tossing ideas across the table like players in a slow, careful game of catch. Where they'd met, how they'd decided to get married, which anniversary date they'd celebrate. "March 17th, Daniel suggested, without hesitation. She arched an eyebrow. "St. Patrick's Day." "It's memorable," he said with a faint shrug, "and easy to remember under pressure. Besides, no one's going to forget the story of how we accidentally got married on a holiday." She found herself smiling. At that, jotting it down. "Fine, March 17th, it is." As the evening went on, they began building layers onto their invented history. She remembered the first time she'd seen him at a used bookstore downtown, both of them reaching for the same battered copy of an old novel. He remembered her laughing at the coincidence and insisting he take the book. They remembered running into each other again 2 weeks later at a coffee shop, striking up a conversation that never quite ended. Each detail they invented felt like laying bricks in a wall they were both standing behind, shielding themselves from suspicion. But there was also something strangely intimate about it, sharing these invented moments, speaking them aloud until they began to take on the texture of truth. When they moved on to body language, things grew even stranger. Daniel was meticulous, almost methodical, about small gestures. "If we're in public, I'll put my hand here," he said one evening, stepping close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. His palm rested lightly at the small of her back, just enough pressure to guide, not enough to claim. "It'll read as protective without being possessive." She swallowed, suddenly very aware of the warmth of his hand and the faint, clean scent of his soap. "Okay," she said, stepping away to make a note. In return, she worked on modulating her voice when speaking to him in public, softening her tone just enough to sound affectionate without overplaying it. They practiced in the grocery store. One afternoon, running through their shopping list while ignoring the curious glances from strangers. "Daniel, love, did you remember to get the tea?" she asked in a tone that felt both foreign and oddly thrilling to her own ears. He caught on quickly, his voice dropping into a warmer register when replying, "Of course, sweetheart." The words were light, practiced, but something about the way they lingered in the air made her stomach tighten. Not everything went smoothly. There were clumsy moments, like the time she instinctively stepped away when he reached for her hand, forgetting they were supposed to look like a couple, or the time he accidentally called her Amelia in a tone that sounded far too formal for a husband addressing his wife, earning a suspicious look from the cashier at the local bakery. Each misstep left them laughing nervously, trying again until it felt right. But then there were moments, brief, almost imperceptible, when the act slipped and something real surfaced. It might be the way his eyes crinkled when she made a particularly bad joke, or how she'd catch herself watching the shape of his hands as he stirred sugar into his coffee. Once, while they were practicing their first meeting story for the 100th time, she forgot her next line because she was distracted by the way the afternoon light fell across his face. softening the sharp planes into something almost gentle. At night, after their rehearsals, she would lie in bed replaying those moments, scolding herself for letting her mind wander down dangerous paths. This was a performance, nothing more, a means to an end. And yet, sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could almost hear the sincerity in his voice echoing back to her, unguarded and unplanned. The days passed in a blur of coffee cups. Inside jokes carefully rehearsed until they sounded effortless, and countless little adjustments to the script. Every time they met, the boundaries between practice and reality blurred just a little more. Amelia told herself it was just because they were getting good at the act. But deep down, she knew that truth was more complicated. Something unspoken was beginning to grow in the spaces between their words. The journey to her parents' countryside estate took most of the afternoon, winding through roads that grew narrower and greener the farther they drove from the city. Amelia sat in the passenger seat of Daniel's car, her hands curled in her lap, watching the world blur past in shades of light summer gold and deep green. The air outside shimmered faintly in the heat, but in the car, there was only the steady hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of paper from the small folder of reference notes they had prepared for their act. Daniel drove with an ease that made her both grateful and unsettled. He didn't chatter to fill the silence. He simply existed beside her, his presence solid and unhurried. Every so often, he'd glance her way, not with the scrutiny of someone checking if she was nervous, but with a kind of quiet acknowledgement, as if saying, without words, "We're in this together." By the time they turned onto the gravel driveway that led to her parents' estate, Amelia's stomach had tied itself into a complicated knot. The house appeared slowly between the rows of old oak trees, its white-painted facade bright against the sweep of green fields beyond. She hadn't been home in years. The sight of it brought a strange rush of emotions, nostalgia, dread, and an ache she hadn't anticipated. "Ready?" Daniel asked softly as he parked. She forced a small smile. "As I'll ever be." They stepped out into the thick, warm air. The sound of distant cicadas filled the silence as they walked toward the front steps. The door opened before they reached it, and there stood her mother, flanked by two of her aunts. Their expressions were a perfect blend of polite welcome and careful assessment, the kind of look one reserves for unfamiliar guests at a family gathering. Introductions were made with the stiffness of people who are already measuring the weight of every handshake and glance. Amelia felt the invisible eyes of the household on them as they stepped inside, cousins leaning against doorframes, an uncle pretending to read a newspaper, her younger sister peeking from behind the banister. The first real test came at the long dining table that evening. They sat side by side, the low murmur of voices filling the room as plates were passed and glasses poured. It didn't take long for the questions to start. "So," her Aunt Lydia began, a woman with a knack for turning casual conversation into cross-examination, "how did you two meet?" Daniel smiled, a slow, easy smile that seemed to soften the edges of the question. "At a bookstore, actually," he said, as if recalling the memory for his own pleasure. "We both reached for the same book. She let me have it, but only after making me promise to read it quickly so she could borrow it next." Amelia almost forgot to nod along. His delivery was so smooth she almost believed it herself. "And when did you know she was the one?" Another cousin chimed in, leaning forward with interest. Daniel didn't hesitate. "The first time we walked through the city in winter. It had just snowed, and she stopped to brush the snow off a bench so we could sit and drink coffee together. She didn't care that it was freezing, she just wanted to enjoy the moment. That's when I knew." The image he painted was entirely fabricated, but his voice held a warmth that made it feel tangible. Amelia could almost feel the bite of cold air, the steam from the coffee cups, the weight of his gaze in that imagined moment. The table chuckled softly at the story, and Aunt Lydia remarkably didn't press further. More questions came over the course of the meal. What their first trip together had been. "A weekend in the mountains," she insisted we hike even though it rained the whole time. "Who was the better cook?" "Her, but only because I burn toast when I'm distracted." "And what they liked to do on quiet nights, we read in the same room. Sometimes we don't even talk for hours, but it still feels like we're together." Closing parenthesis. Each answer was effortless, as if he'd been rehearsing his whole life. Amelia knew the truth. They had gone over possible questions in their kitchen rehearsals, refining answers until they were natural. But Daniel went beyond the script, adding little details: how she tilted her head when concentrating, how she laughed like she was trying to hold it in but couldn't. Her grandmother, who had been silent most of the meal, reached over halfway through and squeezed Amelia's hand. Her palm was warm and dry, the squeeze gentle but firm. "You've chosen well," she whispered, her voice meant only for Amelia. The words hit Amelia harder than she expected. She managed to smile, nodding, as though she'd just been handed a blessing. Inside, though, something shifted. She was relieved, yes relieved, that the performance was working, that her family was beginning to lower their guard. But beneath that relief was a smaller, sharper sensation she couldn't quite name. It was almost like fear. Fear that the warmth in Daniel's voice, the softness in his gaze when he spoke about her, wasn't entirely fabricated. fear that she herself was beginning to lean into the comfort of those invented moments, to want them to be true. The dinner ended with polite goodnights and the clink of dishes being cleared away. But as they walked upstairs to the guest room they'd been given, Amelia could still feel the phantom weight of her grandmother's hand on hers and hear Daniel's voice in her head, describing a winter evening that had never happened. The trouble was, she almost wished it had. The in-between moments were the ones she hadn't prepared for. They were the cracks between the rehearsed lines, the spaces where their careful choreography loosened and real life seeped in. Amelia had expected the big tests, the dinners, the interrogations, the watchful eyes of her relatives. She had braced herself for every question, every forced smile, every public gesture meant to convince. What she hadn't braced for were the quiet, unguarded minutes that followed, when there was no one to perform for but each other. It began with little things. She noticed that Daniel had an odd, almost old-fashioned habit of making sure she was comfortable before himself. If they sat on the porch in the early evening, he would tilt his chair slightly toward her, as though angling himself to catch her words better. If the breeze picked up and the temperature dropped, he would disappear for a moment and return with the thick wool blanket from the guest room, draping it around her shoulders without a word. His touch was brief and matter-of-fact, but there was something in the gesture, something unspoken, that warmed her far more than the fabric itself. The first time he made her tea, it startled her. It was a morning heavy with the damp chill that followed a summer night's rain. She padded into the kitchen, still wearing the cardigan she'd slept in, expecting to find the space empty. Instead, Daniel stood at the counter, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, a kettle steaming gently on the stove. "You take it with milk and 2 sugars, right?" he asked without turning, his voice casual but confident. Amelia blinked. "How do you know that?" He shrugged one shoulder, reaching for the sugar jar. "I noticed. You always stir it 3 times before you take the first sip." She didn't remember him ever watching her closely enough to notice that. The realization landed somewhere deep inside her, in a place she tried not to look too closely at. And then there was the rainy afternoon. It had been a long, heavy day, the kind that made the air thick and the sky bruised dark, hours before sunset. The clouds had been threatening all morning, and by mid-afternoon, the rain finally broke, spilling across the countryside in silver sheets. The sound of it drummed against the porch roof, steady and hypnotic. They had been restless, neither of them in the mood for conversation, until Daniel appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of tea and a raised eyebrow. "Porch," he suggested. She followed him, pulling the blanket from earlier around her shoulders. They sat side by side in the wooden chairs that faced the garden, their knees angled toward each other almost unconsciously. For a long while, they simply listened, the rain on the leaves, the occasional rumble of thunder rolling across the fields. It was Daniel who broke the silence. "When I was a kid, I wanted to be an architect," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I used to draw houses on everything. My mom had to hide the napkins at dinner." Amelia smiled, picturing a younger version of him with a pencil in hand, scribbling floor plans on scraps of paper. "What happened?" "I got older, realized I wasn't as good at math as I thought, and..." He hesitated, taking a sip from his mug. Life got in the way. She didn't press him. Instead, she told him about her own childhood dream, how she'd wanted to be a journalist, traveling the world and writing about things that mattered. How she'd even applied to a university program in the city, only to have her acceptance letter intercepted by her father. He said it wasn't safe, she recalled, her voice soft. "Said I could do the same thing here, close to home. But of course, here, there were no opportunities for that, so I stayed for a while, and then you left," Daniel said, not as a question, but as a quiet acknowledgement. She nodded, eyes on the rain-soaked garden. "I had to. I couldn't breathe anymore." The conversation drifted from there, touching on small confessions and stories that didn't belong in their rehearsed marriage, mistakes they'd made, people they'd lost, times they'd been scared, or lonely, or simply unsure of where they were headed. It wasn't planned. There was no benefit to telling these truths, no audience to be convinced. At one point, he told her about a trip he'd taken alone to the coast, years before they met. He described the way the salt air clung to his skin, the sound of waves hitting the rocks at night, and how strangely freeing it felt to be somewhere where no one knew his name. She told him about a night she'd stayed up until dawn in her city apartment, watching the lights flicker in the windows of the building across the street, inventing stories for the strangers inside. The hours slipped past, measured not by a clock but by the fading light and the steady rhythm of the rain. When Amelia really laughed at a dry comment he made about how his teenage self would be appalled at his current life, something shifted. Daniel turned to look at her, and the expression on his face stopped her breath. It wasn't the easy, performative smile he used at the dinner table. It wasn't the carefully measured warmth of a man playing his part. It was something quieter, more dangerous, and unguarded softness that made her feel suddenly exposed. In that moment, sitting there with rain pooling on the porch steps and thunder rolling far away, she realized that she couldn't entirely tell where the performance ended and reality began. and she had the unsettling feeling that Daniel couldn't either. As the days passed, Amelia noticed a shift. The way he reached for her hand wasn't just for show anymore. The way she leaned into him wasn't just for appearances. At night, she would lie awake, wondering how much of his warmth was real, and how much was habit from the charade. She caught him looking at her once, not with the practiced smile he wore in public, but with a softness that left her breathless. It terrified her because the plan had always been to end this without complications, without hearts getting tangled in the lies they told. Expanded version approximately equals 6,000 words. The shift was subtle at first, so subtle that Amelia almost convinced herself she was imagining it. It was in the way Daniel's hand found hers without the slightest hesitation now, as though muscle memory had replaced the conscious decision. At first, those small touches had been calculated, rehearsed gestures meant to convey intimacy to onlookers, but now, his fingers curled naturally around hers in the hallway, on the porch, even when no one else was in sight. It happened one afternoon, as they walked down the garden path toward the orchard. There was no audience, no relatives lingering behind the curtains, and yet, as they stepped over the uneven stones, his hand slipped into hers. No words, no deliberate flourish, just a quiet linking of fingers. She told herself it was a leftover habit from the days of public performance. But a seed of doubt had already been planted. And then there was her own betrayal, how she leaned into him now. Not for the sake of appearance, but because she wanted to. In the beginning, every brush of her shoulder against his had been carefully timed, her laughter measured, her gaze held just long enough to seem convincing. But the more they moved through this strange shared life, the more she found herself drawn toward him without thinking, her body seeking the comfort of his nearness like it was something it had always known. At night, she would lie in the guest room bed they shared, the darkness pressing in like a secret they weren't ready to name. Daniel wasn't a restless sleeper, his breathing was slow and steady, and yet she often found herself awake, staring at the faint outline of him in the dim light from the window. She would replay the day in her mind, dissecting each smile, each touch, each shared glance. Was the warmth in his voice when he said her name just another layer of the performance? Was the way his hand lingered at her back when they walked through a doorway an unconscious part of the act or something more? These questions circled endlessly, keeping her from sleep. One evening, the answer seemed to break through in the most unexpected way. They had spent the day helping her mother prepare for a small gathering, picking vegetables from the garden, arranging flowers in vases, setting out chairs on the lawn. It had been hot, the kind of heavy summer heat that left the air thick and slow. By the time the guests began to arrive, Amelia's hair was sticking to the back of her neck, and Daniel's shirt clung to his shoulders. She'd been carrying a tray of glasses out to the porch when she caught him watching her, not the way he looked at her when they were on stage for her family, his usual, easy smile in place, eyes warm but guarded. This was different. He was leaning against the porch railing, one hand resting loosely on the wood, the other holding a glass of lemonade, and his gaze was steady, unhurried. There was no performance in it, no calculation, just softness. It caught her completely off guard. She nearly dropped the tray, her breath catching in her throat. She looked away quickly, pretending to adjust the placement of the glasses on the table. But the image of his expression lingered like the afterimage of a bright light burned into her vision. That night, lying in bed, she thought about it again and again. She told herself it was dangerous to think too much about these moments, dangerous to read into things that were better left unexplored, because the plan had always been simple. They would do this for a few weeks, make it believable, and then walk away. No entanglements, no confusion, certainly no feelings. That had been the one unspoken rule between them. The line they had both agreed not to cross, but Amelia was starting to realize that feelings didn't ask for permission. They crept in quietly, through shared laughter and long glances, in the comfort of another person's steady presence. They didn't care about agreements or timelines. She found herself avoiding his gaze sometimes, not because she didn't want to meet it, but because she was afraid of what she might find there and what he might see in her. The truth pressed at the edges of her mind, unwelcome but undeniable. The lines between their fiction and reality weren't just blurring anymore. They were disappearing, and she didn't know if either of them could pretend not to notice much longer. The final day of their agreement came, marked by an unspoken heaviness between them. They were supposed to part ways, return to their separate lives, and file this strange episode under temporary arrangements. But when he took her suitcase to the train station, he didn't let go right away. His fingers lingered around hers, and his voice was quiet when he said, "I don't want this to end." She should have laughed, reminded him it was all pretend, but instead, she found herself stepping closer, her heart pounding in a way that told her the act had ended long ago. Somewhere in the rehearsals, in the stolen glances and unscripted moments, the story they invented had become their truth. Expanded version, approximately equals 6,000 words. The final day arrived with a kind of quiet inevitability, the way the last page of a book waits patiently for the reader to turn it. There was no dramatic countdown, no obvious sign in the air that their arrangement was reaching its end, but Amelia felt it in the spaces between their words. In the way Daniel's smiles that morning didn't quite reach his eyes. They didn't speak much over breakfast. The air was heavy with the things neither of them seemed willing to say. She stirred her tea longer than necessary. He busied himself with tidying the kitchen, stacking plates with a precision that felt almost like avoidance. Outside, the summer sun was bright and indifferent, spilling light across the yard as if mocking the heaviness pressing down on them. The suitcase lay open on the bed in the guest room, half filled with her clothes. Packing felt mechanical, almost surreal. She folded each item with careful precision, as though neatness could keep her from thinking about what leaving actually meant. Daniel appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame with his hands in his pockets, watching her. "I can help," he offered. She shook her head without looking up. "I've got it." But he stepped in anyway, crossing the room to lift the heavier items into place. Their hands brushed once, just briefly, and she felt the faintest jolt of something regret, maybe, or longing. She told herself not to think about it. The drive to the train station was quiet. The road wound away from the countryside and into the edges of the nearest town, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Amelia kept her gaze fixed out the window, watching the fields give way to rows of houses, her reflection in the glass, a pale ghost layered over the passing scenery. When they arrived, Daniel parked close to the station entrance and got out before she could reach for the door handle. He came round to her side, opened the door, and reached for her suitcase. She tried to take it from him, but he shook his head, his fingers tightening slightly on the handle. Inside the station, the noise of travelers surrounded them, luggage wheels clattering against the tile floor, announcements echoing overhead, the murmur of voices blending into a constant hum. It felt strangely jarring after the quiet intimacy of the past weeks. Her train wasn't due for another 15 minutes. They stood near the edge of the platform, the suitcase between them. She told herself to keep her thoughts practical. The ticket, watch the time, remember that this was the moment they had planned for from the start. But her chest felt too tight for logic. Daniel's eyes were on her, steady and searching. When he reached for her hand, it was without pretense, no audience to play to. His fingers wrapped around hers, warm and certain. And then, he didn't let go. "I don't want this to end," he said quietly. The words landed with the weight of something he'd been carrying for days, maybe weeks. They weren't dramatic or rehearsed, they felt raw. The stripped bare of the careful performance they had built together. Amelia's first instinct was to laugh, to make light of it, to remind him that they'd always known this was temporary. But the laughter caught in her throat and never made it out. Instead, she stood there, her heart thudding hard enough to make her feel unsteady. She should have said something sensible. She should have reminded him of the plan, of the reasons they started this in the first place. But instead, she stepped closer, close enough to feel the heat of him, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his eyes. In that moment, the carefully drawn lines of their arrangement dissolved completely. She saw, in quick flashes, all the little moments they'd shared. Way he made her tea without asking, the quiet talks on the porch, the soft looks he gave her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. She realized, with a rush that was both terrifying and thrilling, that the story they had invented together had become the truest thing in her life. The train's arrival was announced over the loudspeaker, the sound breaking into the cocoon of stillness around them. Daniel's grip on her hand tightened fractionally, as though he could hold her there by sheer will. She didn't know what she would do next, but she knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever had happened between them hadn't been pretend for a very long time.